Hi everybody. This is going to be a little awkward for me because I am actually blogging at the Society for Neuroscience conference, and it's really busy. There are lots of people here, and it's going to seem like I'm talking to myself, and I'm going to look like it's schizophrenia. But that might not necessarily be a bad thing here, since a lot of people seem to be studying schizophrenia. I thought I would take you through day 3, just highlights that I saw on the cognitive science side, and I would have done this later, but the lighting would have been bad, and that's life. This morning I started off going to a talk, a long talk. It was from 8:30 to 11, and it was called the Emotional Triad. It was on the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, which are the big 3 neuronal structures in your brain that are really primarily involved in emotional related tasks. And they had some great talkers, I forget who they were, by Dr. Kufi Dizra, and he's an MD PhD over at Duke, and if you're not familiar with his work, he's done a lot of great work modeling psychiatric diseases in animal models and trying to look at the neuronal pathway that's involved in these animal models rather than the individual brain segments themselves. So he was the first one to give a talk. He talked about the problems facing animal models and psychiatric diseases and the problems of frameworking the actual disease itself, because when diagnosing patients themselves, there are so many different symptoms that, 2 different people may be experiencing a completely different set of symptoms, but be classified under the same disease, whether or not we actually know it's the same disease. So that was a really interesting idea that he's talking about, how we're trying to treat a symptom rather than the actual disease in a lot of psychiatric disorders, and how he's trying to progress that forward thinking into determining what the disease is in genetic mice models in order to construct an idea of what it may be in human models, and we can try to break down the pathways in the neurons and see what's being affected in these diseases. So I thought that was really neat. He also talked about a lot of different animal models for PTSD. He also talked about animal models for anxiety and depression. Although what I'm finding with a lot of the animal models for anxiety and depression, a lot of people are using the same things over and over again, and they're not always thinking about looking at the disease in another perspective. So I see a lot of elevated plus maze, and I see a lot of light dark box, and then a lot of people kind of forget about or intentionally leave out open field because they say it conflicts their data. But I think open field is actually a really important test to look at because it's looking at locomotor activity, and if you're looking at locomotor activity, and you can't really control the other tests without understanding the locomotor activity of whatever you're looking at. So that's a side note, and it's kind of one of the things that bothered me about today. Yeah, and so he gave a really great talk, and then after he went, then Joshua Gordon went, and he talked about the directionality of the connection between these 3 different structures and how it affects your response to threats. And so what he really emphasized was that you may have a pathway that goes a certain way, but if it's bidirectional, it may kind of continue to reinforce a certain emotion, and it may kind of cause the emotion to last around longer than it normally would have, than if it just went around the path and then you stimulated it again. So that was a really interesting idea. I think talking about how synaptic plasticity is kind of involved in perpetuating a certain feeling or perpetuating a certain emotion, and easily it would be applied to psychiatric diseases where in anxiety, you're kind of stuck going back and forth between a very consistent emotional state or a motor stereopathy where you're trapped between certain physical motions that you can't control. So I thought that was a really cool idea. And then Dr. Kate from MIT talked about the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex in relation to anxiety-like behaviors in her animal models. And she had some really interesting figures and some really interesting data trying to correlate the idea of anxiety-like behaviors in animals. And she had a really interesting technique where she was looking at the animal behavior while still measuring the neuronal firing and the neuronal signaling within the brain, which I thought was really cool. And so did Dr. Dizera. He he also did that while he was looking at the behaviors while looking at the brain activity, which I thought was a really neat idea, and I think it really shows where we need to be going forwards in our research, because it's really interesting where you can monitor the behavior and assess what's happening in the brain at the same time, so that we can kind of really correlate the two together. So she did a really interesting job of correlating anxiety-like behaviors and directly measuring what's going on in the brain as a result. So that was really cool. I went to go see some posters. The first really cool poster that I saw was Tamaso Pizzuruo. I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong. He's a PhD from the University of Florence, and he talked about fluoxetine inducing plasticine hypothalamic circuits, controlling leptin sensitivity, and food intake. So the idea is that a common symptom that you see in a lot of patients taking fluoxetine have increased weight and increased appetite. And so one of the major ideas is that that fluoxetine is affecting the hypothalamus and thereby kind of causing dysregulation in your hunger hormones. And what was really interesting is that they didn't actually see a difference in food intake. They saw a difference in weight gain. So the animals were eating about the same amount of food. However, the animals on fluoxetine were actually having a decreased weight, even though they were still eating as much food. And so they did a bunch of tests, and they found that fluoxetine increases leptin sensitivity due to the fact that there's an increased amount of leptin receptors. Therefore, that kind of caused an increase in metabolic activity when introduced with stimulus and food. Another interesting thing they saw that explained the weight loss was an increase in nocturnal activity for the fluoxetine-treated animals. So that's kind of cool that it's causing an induced motor activity, which is thereby causing an effect on weight, which is kind of different for what we see in humans. Humans generally tend to gain weight, whereas in the mouse model they actually lost weight. So there's some disconnection there, but I still thought it was a really interesting study and an interesting idea. Another really cool study that I saw today was sex-dependent effects of stress on limited access of ethanol consumption by Deborah Kozzoli, and this is from the Oregon Health and Sciences University. And the reason I liked it so much is because she did a huge battery of different animal behavioral tests, which I thought was really cool and interesting. So she did a restraint test, and she saw how that affects normal versus genetically modified mice alcohol consumption. She also did a tail pinch test. She did a tail suspension test, which is a model for depression. She did a foot shock test, which is a way to induce fear, anxiety. She did a predator odor test, and she measured cortisol levels after the restraint test and looked at their stress level due to the restraint. And it was found that genetically modified animals predispositioned for high consumption of alcohol had increased stress response due to all of these different things, and a really good job of doing a battery of different behavioral tests. So that was really cool. Another really interesting poster, I don't remember the name and I didn't write it down, and I'm really sorry for whoever this is. Please contact me if you know. An animal model for neuropathic pain called passive avoidance, called conditioned place avoidance. And what the idea is that you induce an animal with pain and you put him in a conditioned place preference test where you use a drug as a rewarding stimulus, saying the relief of pain is going to be rewarding, and therefore they would spend more time on a rewarding side of the conditioned place preference. And if the effect is actually harming, then they'll spend the time on the other side. So you can determine if a drug is actually pain relieving for neuropathic pain without inducing any mechanical or thermal stimuli, based off of the preference of the animal, if they prefer a drug or they avoid a drug. So that was a really interesting idea because it involves an animal's choice of, I choose to be on this side of the box or I choose to be on the other side of the box based off of my previous experience with the drug. So that's a very different concept, especially for pain research. Because pain research is a lot of like mechanical stimuli tests and a lot of thermal stimuli tests where you're measuring a response to an acute stimuli. Whereas this test for neuropathic pain is a chronic test for a long period of time and over a long period of time, and it doesn't involve the stimulus per se. It involves them touching the ground and being in pain, but the idea is that a rewarding stimulus will come if it actually does what it's supposed to do. So that was really cool, and it adds in the emotionality effect of pain, which you don't see in traditional pain models. And I've heard of this model before, but it was really cool to see somebody put it to the test and they actually kind of measured it. Last paper that I really want to talk about that I thought was really cool was xenobionic transporters affecting cognitive behavior. So that kind of plays in the idea of how your exposure to different toxicological chemicals can affect your experience with cognitive behaviors. So if you're able to export more xenobiotics that are potentially more toxic out of your system, then your cognitive ability may be less impaired than somebody who can't. And so I think that's a really interesting idea between environment and actual genetics of cognitive ability. I think that has a lot of potential research opportunities and toxicological opportunities as well to just kind of see where that goes. Pretty much it for what I want to talk about today. The general theme for today was not actually about animal models, really. I think I talked about it a lot because that's what I really enjoy. I think today it was mostly about mechanistic approaches at very basic neuronal processes. So I saw a lot of like visual process mapping. I saw a lot of motor process mapping. I saw a lot of attention and somatosensory and motivational mapping of understanding like an olfactory. I saw a great olfactory poster that kind of mapped out the pathway for a certain on-off receptor in a glutamatergic pathway. So I thought that was a really great poster, and I think that people are doing great research on mapping out certain pathways of certain neuronal structures in the brain. So I think that was a big highlight of today, and that seemed to be where people were really interested in today, where most people were going. The animal models were a really small side of it today, which is a huge contrast to yesterday's, where it seemed to be a lot of it, and not many people seemed to gravitate towards those posters. So I think today was primarily mechanistic-based focused, and trying to understand not so much behavior, but basic processing on a molecular function. So that was really cool. But that was all I want to talk to today. I know today's probably got a lot of like noises from the cars. I'm really sorry, but hopefully you understand. Hopefully you understand most of it, and you don't get too distracted by the people in the background. Happy Monday, and I hope to see you guys all tomorrow. Bye.